I didn't grow up with the stories of monsters. Where I was raised, fear came dressed as weather, hunger, illness, things with practical causes and practical ends. Stories were for church halls and winter nights, meant to keep children still. Whatever this was, it didn't arrive with the comfort of fiction. It arrived as a discrepancy. I was working as a surveyor's assistant in the western edge of Pennsylvania Territory years before the land had learned how to pretend it was settled. The job was simple: measure, mark, record. Trees were numbers, streams were lines, hills were obstacles to be noted and worked around. We slept where we could, ate what traveled well, and trusted the maps more than our instincts. That was our first mistake. The forest there didn't feel empty, not full either. It felt held, as though space itself was being rationed, carefully measured by something older than our tools. The trees grew unusually straight, tall in a way that didn't suggest competition for light but obedience to some shared constraint. Their branches rarely crossed paths. Gaps appeared where gaps shouldn't exist. The first time I saw him, I didn't know it mattered. We were making a clearing that shouldn't have been there. No fire damage, no rot, no fallen trunks, just a perfect absence of growth, circular and silent, like the land had been instructed to pause. My supervisor moved ahead to inspect the soil. I stayed back, copying figures into the ledger. That's when I noticed the vertical interruption. At first, I thought it was another tree, dead perhaps, stripped of bark, but the proportions were wrong, too narrow, too smooth, and positioned where no tree would survive, dead center of the clearing, untouched by rot or growth. It stood just beyond the reach of shadow, a man-shaped height, but not a man's structure, no slope of shoulder, no clear head, no visible arms, just a tall, pale silhouette rising out of the grass as if the ground itself had exhaled and forgotten to finish the shape. I stared longer than I should have. It did not move. That was the second discrepancy. Living things shift. Even when still, they correct themselves. Weight settles. Posture adjusts. This thing did none of that. It stood like a mistake frozen mid-correction. I told myself distance was flattering detail. I blinked, looked away, looked back. Still there. I called out to my supervisor. He answered from the far edge of the clearing, irritated at the interruption. When I gestured toward the figure, he followed my line of sight, squinted, then frowned. "Where?" he asked. "Center," I said, "just past the grass." "There's nothing there." I looked again. The clearing was empty. Not empty like before. Empty like something had never been there at all. No depression in the grass, no shadow remnant, no sense of displacement. I didn't argue. I didn't insist. Something in me understood that naming it would only make it more precise, and precision felt dangerous. That night, we camped under trees that creaked without wind. I didn't dream. I didn't need to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw a vertical space without width, height without mass, something tall enough to be mistaken for structure, narrow enough to be overlooked, patient enough to wait for attention to fail. Near dawn, I woke to the sound of footsteps, not approaching, not retreating, circling, slow, even, measured. When I sat up, the sound stopped. Outside the ring of firelight, between two trees that had no business growing that close together, something stood just beyond where shadows agreed to end. It was taller now, or closer. I did not check which. I did not wake the others. I watched until the light returned, and when it did, the forest resumed its careful normalcy, as though nothing had been tested, but something had. And I knew, without knowing how, that this was not the first time it had stood where men measured land. It had been there long before maps, and it had learned where we look and where we don't. The journals didn't call it anything. That was the first thing I noticed when I began reading them years later, how carefully the writers avoided naming what unsettled them. Colonists were not shy people. They named rivers after saints they barely remembered, hills after kings they'd never seen, sickness after whatever fit the symptoms. But in these records, parish logs, missionary letters, family accounts passed down and recopied, the language thinned whenever the subject turned vertical. They wrote around it. I didn't look for those journals at first. I found them because of the children. Entire settlements didn't lose children at once. They would have demanded attention, inquiry, panic. Instead, they lost them one at a time. A boy sent to gather firewood who didn't return. A girl walking the familiar path between cabins who arrived neither at the other end nor back home. Infants left sleeping near the open doors, discovered gone without disturbance. No struggle, no blood, no tracks that made sense. Wolves were blamed where wolves existed. Natives were blamed where guilt needed direction. God was blamed where nothing else fit. But in the margins, always the margins, someone would add a line that didn't belong. The child was seen again before being missed. That phrase appeared more than once, written in different hands across different decades, separated by miles of wilderness and silence. Seen again. I learned to recognize the pattern. A child would be glimpsed standing at the edge of a field long after bedtime, or near the tree line during prayer hours, or beside a fence post that hadn't been there the day before. Adults would call out, annoyed at disobedience, relieved at the child's return. The child would not respond. Someone would walk closer. Then the sighting would collapse, not in disappearance, but into correction. That's not the child. That's too tall. That's too straight. That's too still. By the time the adults reached the spot, nothing remained, except silence where sound should have been. One account from a Virginia tidewater settlement described a mother who followed what she believed was her daughter into a stand of pines behind their homestead. The girl had been missing for 2 days. When the mother saw her standing upright between two trunks, she wept and ran forward. She stopped herself just short of contact. The journal entry doesn't explain why she stopped. It only says she lost the urge to speak. That phrase unsettled me more than any description of fear. She later told the parish priest that her daughter's hair was wrong, too neat, too uniform, hanging straight down without the disorder of sleep or movement. She noticed the hands next, too long, fingers hanging past where they should have ended. The face was described only once and then never again. It did not blink, she said, and it did not lean toward me. When she stepped back, the figure did not retreat. It did not advance. It remained exactly where it was until she turned away. When she looked again, it was gone. Her daughter was never found. In another settlement farther north, a group of children claimed to have followed a quiet man into the woods during a berry-gathering errand. The phrasing mattered, not strange, not scary, quiet. The children said he didn't speak to them, didn't gesture, didn't ask. He simply stood where the path narrowed, tall enough that the sun broke around him instead of over him. When the children moved, he moved not ahead, not behind, but always at the distance where they had to adjust their pace. One child turned back. The others didn't notice when he was gone. That child later described the man bending, not at the waist, but somewhere higher, like the length of him, folded in on itself. He said the face came closer without stepping forward. He said it smelled like old rain and sap. The boy stopped speaking shortly after, not suddenly, gradually. Words thinned, then names, then recognition. He lived into adulthood without ever describing the figure again, but he refused to walk between trees that grew too straight or too evenly spaced. He refused to stand upright in open fields. He slept curled tightly, knees to chest, as though height itself made him vulnerable. There were drawings too, not illustrations, records, marks made by people who weren't artists but needed to show something words wouldn't hold. Charcoal on scrap paper, ink on margins, a repeated shape, tall, narrow, faceless, sometimes no arms, sometimes arms too long, always vertical, never interacting, never touching, just there. What struck me wasn't fear, it was consistency. Different cultures, different beliefs, different dangers, and yet the same mistake repeated itself over and over, mistaking stillness for safety. Assuming that what does not move does not act, believing that silence means absence. But every account that survived shared one detail that mattered more than the rest. The figure never approached first, it waited to be noticed. And once it was noticed, something changed, not in it, but in the observer. Attention seemed to shorten distance, recognition acted like permission. The longer someone looked, the more defined it became, not clearer, but more exact, like a shape resolving itself according to expectation. It wasn't feeding on bodies, it was feeding on orientation, on being placed into the world by a watching mind. I stopped reading the journals after midnight, not because I was afraid, but because I became aware of my posture, how straight I was sitting, how tall the room felt, how the corners seemed farther away than they had earlier. I turned off the lamp, and in the dark, I understood something the columnists never wrote down, but clearly knew. Whatever this tall man was, it didn't hunt, it didn't chase, it didn't need to. It let people walk themselves into alignment. The frontier did not erase the tall man, it gave him room. As settlements pushed westward, the forests changed character. The old growth thinned, replaced by younger stands planted too evenly, cut too cleanly. Loggers praised these woods for their order. They said you could see farther, walk straighter, measure distance without guessing. That was where the reports intensified. Men who worked timber for a living, men who trusted their balance, their sight, their understanding of space, began writing about moments where the forest felt overcorrected. Paths that aligned too neatly, trees spaced with unnatural precision, clearings that seemed to exist only when approached from certain angles, and always, something tall enough to disrupt the horizon. I found one account buried in a camp ledger from the Ohio Territory, written not as a story but as a refusal. A foreman explaining why he would not return to a certain section of land even at penalty of forfeited wages. There is a man there who does not use his legs. That was the entire line. Further pages, written by others, filled in what the foreman would not. Workers spoke of seeing a figure at the edge of their sightline while felling trees. It appeared not ahead or behind, but between, in the narrow vertical gaps where trunks briefly aligned as you moved. It never blocked the path. It never stood where a man would stand. It occupied the spaces no one walks through. One logger described looking up after driving a wedge and realizing the sound of his strikes had stopped echoing. The forest had gone acoustically flat. When he turned, he saw the figure standing several yards away, framed by 3 birch trunks. He didn't see it arrive. He didn't see it shift. He only noticed that the space it occupied had become unavailable, as though depth had been removed from that section of air. He said it wasn't facing him. That detail returned in multiple accounts. The tall man rarely faced anyone directly. It angled itself just enough to suggest orientation without committing to it, like a compass needle refusing to settle. Witnesses reported the sensation that it was aligned with them rather than toward them, as though they were sharing a direction rather than confronting each other. One man swung his axe at it, not in attack, out of reflex. The axe passed through where the figure should have been and struck a tree behind it, biting deep into the wood. The impact vibrated through the clearing. The figure did not react. But when the man pulled the axe free, the tree bled sap in a long, pale streak that dripped downward in a line too straight to be natural. The man quit the camp that night. Later accounts mention the sounds, not footsteps, adjustments, a subtle realignment of weight heard as faint pressure shifts in leaves or soil, like a tall structure redistributing itself without moving its base. The sound came after prolonged observation, never before. That was the pattern emerging now. The longer someone remained aware of the figure's presence, the more the environment began to accommodate it. Trees leaned minutely, shadows stretched where they shouldn't, perspective altered just enough that distance became unreliable. People reported misjudging how far away things were, reaching too short or stepping too far, falling without tripping, colliding with objects they swore hadn't been there moments earlier. The tall man wasn't distorting reality, it was letting reality finish adjusting to it. One winter, a hunting party tracked a deer into a stand of young pines. The tracks led cleanly between the trees, no sign of struggle, no broken brush. Then they stopped. Not abruptly. They simply thinned, as though the deer had been lifted without resistance. The hunters followed the line of sight instead, scanning forward. One of them began laughing, not in fear, in relief. He said he could see the deer standing ahead, perfectly still, upright, waiting. The others did not see it. Why they turned back to him, he was standing straighter than before, his posture rigid, his neck craned upward, his eyes tracked something above their heads. They pulled him back by force. He resisted violently, but with an unnatural rigidity, as though he had aligned himself and did not want to break formation. He never explained what he saw. After that day, he refused to enter forests with evenly spaced growth. He said nature didn't like straight lines unless something was enforcing them. The frontier had expanded the tall man's range, but it had also clarified something crucial. This was not a creature bound to a place. It was bound to geometry, to alignment, to verticality that suggested intent. And the more humans reshaped the land to suit their measurements, the easier it became for the tall man to exist without standing out. By the time rail lines cut through the woods and towns rose in grids, witnesses stopped calling it a man at all. They began calling it a presence, something tall enough to notice, narrow enough to miss. The first enclosed sightings were dismissed as exhaustion. That's how the records framed them. Men overtired from long shifts, eyes strained by low light, minds stretched thin by repetition. Mills ran before dawn and after dusk. Barns were built tall to store what couldn't be wasted. Churches reached upward because that's what faith demanded. All of them created vertical space, and vertical space, I would learn, was never neutral. The earliest mill account came from a grain operation along the Monongahela. A night watchman reported seeing a figure standing between the milling wheels, tall enough that its head should have struck the beams. It did not. Instead, the beams felt misplaced, as though the structure had been measured incorrectly. He described the figure as being too far in the back room. That phrasing confused me until I saw it repeated elsewhere. The tall man, indoors, was never where depth suggested it should be. It occupied the farthest possible point from the observer, regardless of the room's size. No matter how small the space, it found a way to be distant within it. The watchman approached with the lantern. The light reached the figure, but did not define it. Edges refused to sharpen. The glow bent around the silhouette, outlining height without revealing surface. When the man stopped walking, the figure did not advance. But when the watchman took a step back, the figure became taller, not by movement, by proportion. The ceiling beams began to feel lower, the floor closer, the space compressed around the figure as if the building itself were rescaling to accommodate its presence. The watchman fled. The mill burned 3 months later, though no cause was recorded. Barnes came next. Farmhands reported seeing something standing in the loft at night, silhouetted against slated walls where moonlight leaked through. The figure never blocked the light completely. Instead, it divided it, splitting beams into unnatural angles, creating shadows that didn't agree with the source. One man climbed the ladder to confront it, assuming a trespasser. He said the ladder shortened as he climbed, not physically. Each rung still existed, but the distance between them felt altered, as though his legs were being asked to move farther than expected. Halfway up, he stopped. The figure was not above him. It was level, its head aligned with his own. Despite being visible moments earlier from the ground, the loft had not lowered. The figure had not descended. Height had been reassigned. The man climbed down without looking away. When he reached the ground, the loft was empty. Churches recorded fewer incidents, but they were more severe. One minister wrote of standing alone in the nave at night, rehearsing a sermon. He sensed someone behind him, not close, but present. When he turned, he saw a tall shape standing at the back of the church, framed by the door. It did not enter. It did not leave. It simply stood where the building narrowed, where the walls rose cleanly without interruption. The minister said it felt as though the figure belonged to the architecture more than he did. He approached the altar to create distance. The distance did not increase. Every step forward shortened the room behind him. The tall man remained at the same apparent range, fixed in relation to the minister rather than the building. That was new. This wasn't a figure occupying space. It was sharing orientation. The minister knelt to pray. When he stood, the figure was gone. But the church never felt empty again. Parishioners reported feeling taller inside than they were outside. Sound carried oddly, stretching upward instead of outward. Children refused to sit in the rear pews. By now, the pattern was undeniable. The tall man adopted. Outdoors, it used distance. Indoors, it used proportion. It didn't need forests or clearings. It needed vertical intention. Spaces designed to reach upward, to store, to honor, to elevate. And as American structures grew taller, cleaner, more geometric, the tall man leaned to stand among them without contradiction, not hiding, integrating. Witnesses stopped describing fear. They described displacement. The sense that they were no longer the tallest thinking thing in the room. The first roads weren't built to last. They followed terrain instead of defying it. Wagon ruts carved by repetition. Paths widened by necessity. Fences raised not to claim land but to claim animals from wandering into danger. These roads bent. They dipped. They corrected themselves naturally over time. Then came the straight lines, surveyed roads, property boundaries drawn without regard for slope or stone, rail beds leveled with violence, fences stretched tight between posts like statements rather than barriers. And along those lines, the tall man appeared more often than anywhere else. Not standing on the road, standing with it. Travelers wrote about seeing a figure parallel to their movement, pacing them at a fixed distance beyond the fence line. It did not cross, it did not approach. It remained aligned, its height uninterrupted by posts, ditches, or uneven ground. One man riding alone at dusk described the sensation of being escorted without consent. He said the figure appeared whenever the road straightened and vanished when it curved. As long as the path remained true, the tall man remained visible. When the man slowed his horse, the figure did not slow. When he sped up, the figure did not rush. It adjusted without motion. Rail workers reported something worse. During construction of an early spur line, crews noticed a tall shape standing at the far end of cleared track each morning, always at the same distance, always framed by the rails. They assumed a survey marker at first, then a watchman. It never resolved into either. As the track extended, the figure remained exactly where the rails converged in perspective. No matter how much ground they covered, it occupied the vanishing point, the place distance pretends to end. Men stopped volunteering for the forward crew. One engineer wrote that it felt as though the line was being laid toward something rather than through land. The tall man was not waiting at the end. It was defining where the end was allowed to exist. Fences created their own variations. Farmers saw the figure standing just beyond property lines, tall enough to be seen from every angle but never close enough to be confronted. When approached, it did not retreat. It simply ceased to be visible, replaced by the fence itself, suddenly feeling taller than it had moments before. Children learned to avoid fences, fence corners. Dogs refused to cross gates they'd used for years. Horses shied at nothing visible, their bodies reacting to space rather than sight. One account from Indiana described a family whose fence posts began to lean not outward but inward, as though pulled by something running parallel just beyond the boundary. Measurements taken days apart showed no charge and no change in distance between posts, yet the alignment felt wrong, too precise, too obedient. The tall man was no longer just appearing along the routes, it was using them. Roads trained people to look forward, not outward. Rails taught the eye to accept narrowing distance. Fences instructed the mind where not to look. All of it reduced the angles from which something tall and narrow could be noticed. That was when the disappearances resumed, not sudden, not dramatic. Travelers who never arrived, workers who stepped off the line and were never seen again, children who followed paths that ended too cleanly, no tracks leaving the road, no evidence of struggle, just an interruption where continuity should have been. By the time authorities began collecting reports, the language had changed. People no longer said they saw something. They said the road felt occupied, that a route no longer belonged entirely to those traveling it, that something tall had learned how humans move and had positioned itself accordingly. Towns were supposed to end it. That was the belief, at least, that density diluted danger, that crowds erased the unknown, that anything tall and unmoving would be noticed, questioned, corrected. Wilderness allowed ambiguity. Civilization demanded explanation. The tall man adjusted. Early town records didn't describe fear, they described confusion. Moments when people noticed something was wrong only after realizing how long it had gone unquestioned. A shopkeeper in a Pennsylvania river town wrote about a figure he assumed was a lamppost at the edge of the square. He remembered thinking it oddly placed, but towns were full of odd placements, temporary fixes, half-finished projects, things meant to be addressed later. It wasn't until snowfall that the mistake became obvious. Snow accumulated on rooftops, carts, railings, not on the figure. It stood dry and uninterrupted, dividing falling flakes without dispersing them. The snow gathered behind it instead, creating a faint vertical gap that looked like a measurement error in the air. By the time the shopkeeper fetched others, the figure was gone. The gap remained. Towns taught people not to stare. That mattered more than size. People learned to ignore what didn't immediately demand attention. Figures standing too still, silhouettes that didn't wave back, shapes that blended into the background of daily motion. The tall man exploited the habit perfectly. In one Ohio town, a woman recalled walking past the same tall figure near the courthouse steps every morning for nearly a week. She assumed it was a statue awaiting installation. When she finally looked closely, she noticed it had no base. It simply occupied space. She said it felt impolite to keep looking. By the time she returned with her husband, the courthouse steps felt taller than they had before, each riser subtly higher. The climb more tiring. The figure was gone, but the space remembered it. Factories brought a new variation. Shift changes created brief moments when workers stood in lines, still, upright, oriented forward. In those moments, some workers noticed a shape that matched their posture too closely, standing just beyond the group. Always taller, always aligned. It did not disrupt the line. It extended it. Men who noticed reported a strange urge to straighten their backs further, to correct their stance, to face forward even when spoken to. Supervisors assumed discipline issues. No one connected the behavior to the missing workers until months later. The missing were always lost in line. The tall man no longer required distance or isolation. It required permission through neglect. In crowded streets, witnesses reported momentary losses of depth perception. Buildings appeared closer than they were. Alleyways stretched longer than expected. People brushed against others who hadn't been there a second earlier. No one screamed. No one ran. They simply corrected their path and moved on. One report from a Midwestern rail town described a man who stepped aside to avoid colliding with a tall stranger on the sidewalk. He remembered thinking the stranger was unusually thin, his coat hanging too straight. When he turned to apologize, no one stood behind him. Pedestrians continued walking through the space without hesitation. The man remained frozen, unable to explain why he felt he had narrowly avoided something far worse than collision. Towns didn't banish the tall man, they perfected it. Here, it didn't need to be feared or named or watched. It only needed to stand where people expected something to be and let their minds fill in the rest. No pursuit, no confrontation, just a steady reduction of certainty. By the time someone realized a person was missing, the tall man had already stepped back into alignment, becoming another unnoticed vertical in a town full of them. The tall man did not avoid being photographed. That surprised me. I expected the accounts to stop once cameras entered the record, once human memory no longer carried the burden of accuracy. But the opposite happened. Sightings increased, sharpened, and in some cases became repeatable. The problem was never whether the camera captured something. The problem was what it captured instead. Early photographs from town squares, factory floors, and school groups began showing anomalies that couldn't be dismissed as exposure errors or chemical defects. Not distortions, absences. Narrow vertical regions where detail collapsed, lines of background that refused to meet, faces cut off as the forehead by nothing visible. Photographers blamed lenses, developers blamed plates, but the same narrow void appeared across different equipment, different locations, different decades, always tall, always proportioned incorrectly. One school photograph from Illinois showed a class of children arranged in 3 rows, no extra figure arranged in the image, yet the spacing between 2 children in the back row was too wide to explain. Teachers remembered no one standing there. The children remembered differently. Several insisted a man had been present when the photo was taken, standing behind them, not touching, not instructing. They said he didn't blink when the camera flashed. They said he smelled like dust and cold metal. The photographer recalled nothing unusual. But after that day, two of the children stopped appearing in photographs altogether, not missing from life, just from images. They stood there where they always did, but plates rendered them faint, washed, half erased. The tall man had not entered the frame. It had reassigned depth. Factories provided more disturbing evidence. In a series of photographs documenting an assembly line, one image showed a vertical blur running behind the workers, narrow, straight, uninterrupted from floor to ceiling. Engineers assumed a plate scratch. Then they noticed the blur appeared only in images taken at the moment the line paused. When motion ceased, when bodies aligned. Later images showed workers standing slightly farther apart, though no changes had been ordered. Foremen noticed men correcting their posture not aggressively, holding themselves straighter than required. One man collapsed during a shift change, not from exhaustion, from disorientation. He told the company doctor that something had stood too close to him, not touching, not moving, just matching him. He said it had no face, only the suggestion of one where light failed to agree. Photography introduced permanence, and permanence created recognition. Once an image existed, people could return to it, stare at it, argue over it. The tall man tolerated this, but only to a point. When images were circulated too widely, the voids deepened. Details bled away, negatives degraded inexplicably. In one case, a photograph of a barn interior showed the figure clearly enough that the photographer attempted to sell it as a curiosity. Before he could, the negative cracked straight down the center, not shattered, not warped, split. After that, images stopped showing the tall man directly. Instead, they showed adjustments. Ceilings too low, doorways too tall. People framed lower in the image than they remembered standing. The camera had learned what the eye learned earlier. It did not record the tall man. It recorded the consequences of its presence, and that was worse, because now there was evidence, mechanical, unarguable, that something tall had stood where it should not have been, and that something understood how to avoid being captured without leaving. It started as a complaint, not a phenomena. Doctors, schoolmasters, and factory supervisors began noting the same issue in entirely different places. People were standing incorrectly, not slouching, overcorrecting, holding themselves too rigid, too vertical, as though afraid to bend. Children were the first to be noticed. Teachers wrote about students who refused to sit properly, who remained standing at odd times without instruction. When told to sit, they hesitated, confused, as though the act required permission. When they did sit, they chose seats with clear vertical lines behind them, chalkboards, door frames, window mullions. One schoolmaster described a boy who stood at the back of the room every morning, aligned perfectly between two maps. He never moved unless spoken to directly. When asked why he stood, he said, "So it knows where I am." No one asked him what it was. Doctors encountered adults with unexplained stiffness, not muscular, not skeletal. Men complained of discomfort when blending. Women reported dizziness when looking upward too quickly. Several patients described a sensation of being incorrectly sized for their surroundings, as though the world had recalibrated around a different standard of height. Mirrors became a problem. Barbers noted customers flinching when catching their reflection unexpectedly. Some adjusted their posture compulsively, trying to align themselves with door frames or wall seams reflected behind them. One man refused to face the mirror directly, insisting that something taller appeared just over the view when he did. He was institutionalized shortly afterward. No one recorded what he claimed to see. Public buildings amplified the effect. Stairwells, hallways, corridors designed for efficiency rather than comfort. People paused in them without realizing why, standing still for seconds at a time, perfectly upright, not resting, waiting. The tall man no longer needed to appear. Its proportions had been adopted. People began reacting to the posture themselves, training their bodies to accommodate something that was no longer visible. Towns reported increases in unexplained falls, fainting spells, sudden vertigo. Investigations blamed architecture, nutrition, stress. No one noticed the common factor. Everyone was getting taller, not in measurement, but in expectation. One particularly troubling account came from a rural schoolhouse converted into a meeting hall. Chairs were arranged for an event, but several remained unused at the back of the room. Witnesses said the space felt reversed, as though something was expected to stand there. Throughout the evening, speakers reported difficulty focusing. They felt watched, not from the audience, but from behind it. Each time someone turned to look, the sensation worsened. Afterward, several attendees realized they had stood through most of the event without noticing. Aligned, silent. The tall man had crossed a threshold. It was no longer an observer. It was a template. A silent correction applied to bodies and species alike, and once people began adjusting themselves unconsciously, the need for direct sightings diminished. The pattern sustained itself. The last true sightings, clear, undeniable, came from those who resisted the posture, those who bent too often, those who refused straight lines, those who lived crooked lives in crooked spaces. They reported something standing nearby, watching, not angry, not curious, evaluating. People didn't disappear all at once. That's the mistake later writers made, trying to force drama where there was none. The tall man never needed spectacle. By this point, it had learned patience more precise than hunger. The disappearances happened by reduction. Records from the late 19th century show a strange clerical trend. Individuals listed as present but contributing less. Census entries corrected downward. Employment logs showing reduced hours with no explanation. Medical charts, nothing. Weight loss without illness. Height measurements inconsistent across visits. People were still alive. They were simply taking up less space. Witnesses described acquaintances who seemed harder to notice in a room, not visible, just easy to overlook. Conversations drifted past them. Chairs felt too large when they sat. Coats hung loose on shoulders that hadn't shrunk, yet somehow failed to fill the fabric. Photographs confirmed it. Group portraits showed people standing closer together over time, though no one remembered rearranging themselves. Those affected appeared slightly blurred at the edges, as if depth failed to resolve around them, not fading, compressing. One factory ledger recorded a man who continued working for 6 months after colleagues swore he'd left town. His name remained on schedules, his wages were collected, tools were returned to their place at the end of each shift. No one remembered seeing him leave. By the mid-20th century, the tall man no longer required wilderness, roads, or even the towns where it had first asserted itself. It had become an inheritance, a structural expectation woven into human behavior. Children growing up in houses with high ceilings instinctively felt the need to stand straighter. Office workers in newly constructed skyscrapers reported discomfort if they slouched. Gym teachers noticed students adjusting posture mid-exercise without instruction. Architects noted repeatedly that rooms woven into human behavior. The tall man no longer had to appear. It lived in alignment, in space, in expectation. One account came from a family moving into a newly built suburban home. The father, a builder himself, was struck by the sense of imbalance the moment he stepped inside. Windows were taller than normal. Doors stretched upward. He shook off the sensation and unpacked the furniture. That night, his children complained of shadows leaning differently than they had in their last home. One set of closest felt too fall to hide in. He dismissed it as imagination. The next morning, he noticed small adjustments, chairs out of place, clothes draped differently, everything subtly corrected to upright lines. It was no longer a figure. It was a standard, a silent enforcer of verticality. People who resisted, those who preferred correct lines, low ceilings, or harp-sized and haphazard spaces, often felt discomfort, unease, even subtle anxiety. They were aware of the tall man without seeing it, and some of them vanished not through violence or force, but by gradual reduction, slipping into spaces overlooked by human attention, becoming absorbed into the world they refused to accommodate properly. By now, the tall man was everywhere. Buildings, streets, furniture, posture, even photographs. Its influence extended through human behavior, shaping how bodies moved, how eyes tracked, how spaces were used. It no longer needed to approach anymore. Its presence had been integrated into the environment itself, waiting silently for those who resisted its unspoken rules. It had become eternal, not because it conquered, but because it taught people to stand straight without noticing, to measure, to obey space without realizing. It had inherited permanence through human compliance. The tall man's final stage was subtle, almost imperceptible. By the late 20th century, there were no reports of a figure, no direct sightings, no screams in forests or factories, and yet its influence persisted, silently shaping human perception. People moved through spaces without realizing they were adjusting to something unseen. Hallways, stairwells, classrooms, offices, homes, everywhere posture, perspective, and spacing were unconsciously corrected. The world had learned to accommodate it. The tall man no longer occupied space, it defined it. In one urban apartment complex, residents reported a recurring unease. Rooms felt too tall, shadows stretched unnaturally, children refused to reach the upper shelf, though they could easily do so. Mirrors reflected slightly off angles, making people appear smaller, taller, aligned. No one knew why, no one spoke of it, but discomfort hung in the air. An architect analyzing old plans noticed a pattern. Buildings constructed after a certain period showed a consistent preference for uninterrupted vertical lines, ceilings higher than needed, always straight and narrow. The designs didn't make sense structurally, aesthetically, or economically, yet they persisted. By now, the tall man was everywhere, yet nowhere, not a legend, not a story, but a silent template that measured posture, space, and attention. It was inherited with rooms, hallways, doors, and ceilings, and it waited for those who failed to stand straight, for those who refused to measure up, for those who believed space belonged only to them. It had won not by force, but by patience, not by action, but by the slow, unbroken reshaping of reality. And somewhere in every building, forest edge, or road, the tall man still stood, or rather, made sure you did. The height never ends.